Progressive Skills in English by Terry Phillips and Anna Phillips. Copyright 2011, Garnet Publishing Limited. CD 1. Progressive Skills in English Level 3 Coursebook. 1.1. Theme 1. Remembering and Forgetting. Lesson 1.1. Vocabulary for Listening. Types of Memory. Exercise B. Listen to a text. Number the words and phrases below in the order you hear them.
Have you got a good memory? Some people are good at remembering names. Other people have a good memory for faces or telephone numbers or events from their own lives. Some people seem to be able to memorize facts easily. For example, the date of a battle or the capital of a country. For centuries, teachers used rote learning, or learning by heart, for information such as the times tables. For example, 7 times 8 is 56. According to some researchers, there are two main kinds of memory. First, there is short-term memory. This helps us remember a telephone number, for example, just long enough to write it down. Secondly, there is long-term memory. In theory, we can remember things in long-term memory forever. Psychologists say there are 3 main kinds of long-term memory. Firstly, we remember how to do things. This means we can perform skills such as driving or playing a sport. Secondly, we remember facts. We remember the dates of famous battles, for example, the name of the first president of the United States, or the population of our country. Finally, we remember autobiographical events. In other words, we can recall personal experiences and recognize familiar faces, for example. We remember going to interesting places when we were younger. Neuroscientists point out that memory has 3 stages. Firstly, the information must be encoded or taken in. Secondly, the information must be stored. Thirdly, the information must be correctly retrieved. Memory can fail in any of the 3 stages. In other words, we can forget the information if we don't regularly remind ourselves about it.
(1.2) Lesson 1.2. Real-time listening. Memory models.
Hello. Now, in this lecture, we are going to look at a very important process. It's the process of getting new information into long-term memory. Now, there are several memory models that different researchers have discussed, but we're only going to look at one model today. It's the multi-store memory model. Firstly, we'll look at the components of the model. Then we'll see how information moves through the different parts of the brain according to the model. So first, let's look at the components of the multi-store memory model. It was proposed by 2 researchers called Atkinson and Shiffrin, and they wrote an article in 1968. It was entitled The Psychology of Learning and Motivation. In the article, Atkinson and Shiffrin say that there are 3 parts to memory. Firstly, there is sensory memory. The word sensory is the adjective from sense. It means related to sight, hearing, and so on. Now, sensory memory lasts from 1 to 3 seconds. The second part of the multi-store model is short-term memory. Short-term memory lasts from 15 to 30 seconds. And finally, we have long-term memory. Now, long-term memory can last a lifetime. Okay, now let's consider how information moves through the 3 parts of the memory. First, sensory memory. All 5 senses can lead to memories. For example, we use sight for recognizing people. We use hearing for recognizing a piece of music. Atkinson and Shiffrin say that we must pay attention to a piece of sensory information to move it into short-term memory. So, for example, our eyes see a telephone number. Now, we only put it into short-term memory when we actually look at it. Okay. So the first stage of memory is paying attention. When we pay attention, we move information. It goes from sensory memory to short-term memory. But short-term memory doesn't last for long. We must do something with the information in short-term memory. If we don't, new information from sensory memory pushes out old information. The best-known research in this area was conducted by Miller. In 1956, he wrote an article which was called "The Magical Number 7, Plus or Minus 2." In the article, Miller says that short-term memory can only hold about 7 pieces of meaningless information. For example, it can hold a telephone number. When an 8th piece comes along, one of the 7 pieces is pushed out. Long-term memory is the final stage in this model. According to Atkinson and Schifrin, we need rehearsal to move information from short-term memory. So in other words, we need to repeat information in our heads. We need to say it again and again, and perhaps again. Then it will be moved from short-term to long-term memory. So that's the multi-store model. In the next lecture, we'll look at the idea of rehearsal in more detail. Is it just repetition, or is there more involved? That's next time.
Lesson 1.3 Learning New Listening Skills. Recording Sources. Exercise A. Listen to part of the lecture from Lesson 1.2. Number the sentence endings in the correct order.
1. The model was proposed by 2. They wrote an article in 3. It was entitled 4. In the article 5. Firstly 6. Sensory is 7. Sensory means 8. Sensory memory lasts 9. The second part of the multi-store model is 10. Finally, we have
1.4 Exercise C. Listen to some extracts from a lecture on memory. 1.
Short-term memory was originally called primary memory. The first real investigation of primary memory was in 1887. That's 1887, not 1987, so well over 100 years ago. A man called Joseph Jacobs conducted an experiment. He gave people sets of numbers to remember. The sets got longer and longer. Jacobs found the average is around 6 or 7.
2.
Let's see how we encode sensory information. A man called Conrad did some experiments in 1964. In an article entitled Acoustic Confusions in Immediate Memory, Conrad said that we encode sensory information as sound. But only 6 years later, in 1970, another researcher called Schulman did some more experiments. He reported his findings in the Journal of Verbal Learning and Verbal Behavior. Schulman found that some information is encoded for meaning, not sound.
3.
Peterson and Peterson published a study in 1959. It was called Short-Term Retention of Individual Verbal Items. They looked at the length of short-term memory if there was no rehearsal. Peterson and Peterson found people can remember meaningless shapes without rehearsal for about 3 seconds. But after 18 seconds, nearly everything is forgotten. Did I say the date? It was 1959.
4.
A group of researchers looked at long-term memory in 1975, I think it was. Let me check my notes. Yes, 1975. Bauerich et al. Wanted to test the length of long-term memory. They showed people photographs of school classmates and asked them to recognize the people. Bauerich and his team found that long-term memory declines over long periods of time.
5.
Another model of memory is called the working memory model. This was proposed by Baddeley and Hitch in 1975. So that's the same year as Bauerich et al.'s research. Baddeley and Hitch looked mostly at short-term memory. There is one main difference between this model and the multi-store model. The working memory model suggests that short-term memory has several different parts, and each part has its own function.
(1.5) Exercise D. Listen to the stressed syllable of some words from this theme. Number the correct word in each case.
1. Volve. 2. Mem. 3. Sid. 4. Rec. 5. 10. 6. Search. 7. In. 8. T. 9. Form. 10. Code. 11. Retrieve. 12. Call.
(1.6) Skills check. Listen to extracts from the lecture in 1.1 again. 1.
So, first, let's look at the components of the multi-store memory model. It was proposed by two researchers called Atkinson and Schifrin. They wrote an article in 1968. It was entitled The Psychology of Learning and Motivation.
2.
We must do something with the information in short-term memory. The best-known research in this area was conducted by Miller. In 1956, he wrote an article. It was called The Magical Number 7 Plus or Minus 2.
(1.7) Lesson 1.4. Grammar for listening. Indirect questions. Verb patterns. Exercise B. Listen to some more indirect questions. Make a heading for the notes in each case.
1. I'm going to discuss how we encode sensory information. 2. We'll see what the researchers discovered. 3. I'm going to explain why this research is important. 4. Let's consider how this happens. 5. We'll find out who the famous people are in this area. 6. Let's consider how many pieces of information we can remember in short-term memory. 7. I'll explain why this research is important for learners. 8. We'll look at how information moves through the brain.
(1.8) Exercise C. Listen to the beginning of some sentences. Choose the best way to complete each sentence.
1. At school, we learnt about. 2. Don't forget. 3. I remember. 4. I'd like to learn how. 5. My tutor is very nice. She reminds me of... 6. My tutor usually reminds me about...
1.9. Lesson 1.5. Applying new listening skills. Moving information into long-term memory.
In the last lecture, I described how the multi-store memory model works. We saw what the components are, and I explained how memory is moved through the system. At the end, I also mentioned repetition. According to Atkinson and Schifrin, you need rehearsal to move the information to long-term memory. Atkinson and Schifrin said that rehearsal is simply repetition. But other researchers disagree. And in this lecture, we're going to look at how you can rehearse information. In other words, we'll consider what you can do to move information into long-term memory. We'll also consider how teachers can help students with this process.
(1.10)
Firstly, rehearsal involves frequency. Repetition of new information ensures frequency. So, for example, when you hear a new word, you can say it to yourself 10 times. But other researchers say repetition is not enough to move information into long-term memory. You need variety as well. A man called Thurgood wrote an article about learning in 1989. I think that's correct. Let me check. Yes, 1989. It's entitled The Integrated Memory and the Integrated Syllabus. Thurgood agreed that you need frequency, but he said you also need variety. For example, you need to read a new word in several different situations. Then you need to hear it in some more situations. Then perhaps you need to use it yourself. So yes, rehearsal involves frequency, but according to Thurgood and to others, it also involves variety. It involves doing different things with new information. All right? Now, the second idea is activity. More than 2,000 years ago, Aristotle wrote a book in around 325 BCE. It's called Ethics. Aristotle said in this book that we learn by doing. So he believed in activity. In fact, he believed that it's the only way to learn. So Aristotle was writing about memory and learning in 325 BCE. I find that incredible. Association is the third idea. A little more recently than Aristotle, less than 20 years ago, in fact, a man called Tony Buzan wrote a well-known book in 1993. It's called the Mind Map book. In this book, Buzan says that it's very important to make associations between pieces of information. His main method is the mind map. Now, a mind map looks like a spidergram. You draw lines to link information. Buzan says this will help you remember new information. Since 1993, Buzan has written several other books on this subject. Finally, we have the idea of mnemonics. A mnemonic is a very clever way of remembering something. For example, perhaps you want to remember the planets of the solar system. Now, there's a well-known mnemonic to this in English. It is, my very efficient memory just stores up 9 planets. Francis Yates wrote a book in 1966. It's called The Art of Memory. In this book, Yates says that mnemonics were first proposed by a Greek man. This was before Aristotle's time, in around 487 BCE. Sorry, that should be 477 BCE. He was called Simonides. So we can thank Simonides for this useful way of remembering information. So, according to different researchers in this field, there are at least 5 ways to rehearse information. They are frequency, activity, variety, association, and mnemonics. You should try all of these methods during your course and see which ones work for you.